focus on economic and effective integrated weed management techniques specific to pasture forages. Dr. Flessner evaluates herbicides for weed control efficacy and forage safety. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Flessner here at our field day today. And I do hope that some of you brought weeds for identification.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here. Had a good drive out after a good football victory last night, so happy to be here with you guys this morning, and can do more of the weed ID in the afternoon. I was looking around out there before I came in. There's a couple of good weeds out there, so we'll have at least something to look at there. There's always a good weed around, right? So I knew I didn't have to rely on bringing stuff all the way from Blacksburg. So we're going to talk some pasture weed management here for the next little bit. So of course, as we heard this morning from Chris of Vitalis, we're trying to optimize livestock performance through what we're putting in the belly of those animals, right? That's what we're focused on the forages part of that. So to do that, we've got to optimize obviously the quantity we're getting, and you see different ways of doing that, maybe incorporating some native warm season grasses, and then also the quality of what's in there. So, you know, leaves are better than stems. Desirable forage grasses are probably better than weeds in most cases. So, and you see that with performance athletes, right? There's not any performance athlete that's just going to go out there and eat McDonald's every day and then go win a gold medal in the Olympics, right? You got to put in good things into your body so you can get things out of it, and our animals are no different than that. We've got to be feeding them top quality stuff if we're expecting top quality results from them. So to optimize forages, and you probably heard that already this morning, is we've got to look at, in my mind, there's kind of three things we have to be doing. We got to be, first of all, taking our soil tests and following those recommendations. From a weed management perspective, this is going to give our forages a much better competitive advantage over the weeds if we've got the soil fertility where it's optimized for those grasses or for those legumes or whatever's out there. So that's going to give the forages a jump start on the weed in the weed competition that is always going to be there. We've also got to be doing our proper grazing and haying management, right? If we're beating those forages down or overgrazing them, that's going to open up the canopy to weeds to come in. If we're cutting them too low for haying, those kinds of things. If we're getting the animals in there continuously or too quickly and not letting those grasses recover, it's going to open things up for weed infestation. Then, of course, we also, even those two things alone probably aren't going to get us to a completely weed-free pasture. But in my mind, this is a three-legged stool. We've got to be doing all three of these. If we're just focused on weed management, but we're not properly grazing our pastures, we're not going to get to where we want to go. So we've got to be doing all three of these things at the same time. All right, so weeds are not desirable plants. That's like the definition of a weed, right? And they're not desirable because they do a lot of bad things for us. And so when you look at this list here, we know that we can reduce forage quality, quantity. We'll take a look at some data on that. They can also reduce stand longevity. So if we're looking at like an alfalfa stand or pure orchard grass stands, things that we have some longevity concerns with, weeds are gonna get us to that renovation point quicker, right? Or even if it's a pretty good hardy tall fescue stand that it's almost hard to get rid of in Virginia. Weeds are my, if we let weeds get away from us, it's going to be quicker until we have to get to a renovation standpoint or from coming in with some heavy herbicides kind of point there. Obviously, we're going to reduce our carrying capacity. We're going to be competing with the forages. One thing to think about it is weeds can be poisonous, right? And so a lot of times, well, definitely there's weeds out there that can result in the death of an animal. They're certainly out there, and we could talk about those. I think more what happens with poisonous weeds is they're not acutely toxic where they're killing the animal, but they just give the animal an upset stomach. They're not feeling well. They're not going to eat as well. And I'm the same way, right? And I'm sure you are too. If you've got an upset stomach, you don't want to go have a big cheeseburger, right? You're kind of just wanting to lay back. You're not eating anything. You're not putting on weight, or you're not producing quality milk. Whatever the case may be. So the poisonous weeds out there can be an issue even if you're not seeing death of the animal, and a reason we would want to control them and get rid of them. Another thing that weeds can do that maybe isn't inherently obvious, because you didn't need to come all the way from Blacksburg to tell you that weeds are bad, but one thing would be that they reduce the forage utilization. And so certain weeds, you'll see that certain weeds are grazed and actually can in some ways contribute to the nutrition of the animal, but there's certain weeds that they won't touch, and you'll see a ring of desirable forage grasses that are growing up around it and amongst that weed, but the animals aren't grazing that when they're given the choice, right, when the pasture setting versus feeding them hay. And so you're growing maybe good quality forage right there, but the animals aren't getting to it because the weed's there, and so you're not ultimately getting that to the belly of the animal. It's not doing us any good, right? So weeds are bad for a number of reasons, and then the last thing here is the pasture just doesn't look as good, right, with weeds there. So when we take weeds out using a selective herbicide, it's really easy to see some results. And so here's a plot that Milestone was applied to, or really. So this side you see non-treated. We've got some spotted knapweeds, veg straw, some horseweed in there versus. Here we've got much more desirable grasses, right? So you can see that. Another just plot here in tall ironweed. So this was Graze On Next. 1 year after treatment, you can still see where that plot was and where all that ironweed was around it. So it's easy to see the benefit when we use a herbicide and we remove those weeds visually. But we also, as a scientist, I want to see some data. Is that doing us any good? Are we growing more forage? Are we getting that to the belly of the animal? And those kinds of things. So taking a look at this, here's just a nice demonstration slide. So it's a strip plot here where they applied a herbicide and they left one side without the herbicide, and they came back and harvested that. And here's what the results that you see. So the desirable forage here in the bag, and then the bundle of weeds here on the herbicide side. We've got much more forage than where the herbicide wasn't, and here we have much fewer weeds than where the herbicide was applied. And so we actually look at the weights of those. We actually over doubled the amount of forage that was grown just in those strips from helping remove the weed competition from that. So kind of parsing that out maybe a little bit more here in another slide, so that we can mow is one thing we can do for weeds, and certainly that can help us, as you can see in one of these slides, because as Vitalis was talking about, the growing point of the grass is down low versus most of our broadleaf weeds. It's up at the shoot apex, the tip of that weed, and so if we cut that off, it's much harder for those broadleaf weeds to come back from that kind of thing than it is for a grass that can more easily come back from that kind of thing. So mowing can do us some good, right? But mowing in and of itself maybe not get us as far as a herbicide, as we'll see here in these slides. So here we have the yield. Of course, more is always better when we're talking about yield. And then we have various treatments. So the control here is where nothing was done. The green bar is the amount of grass, it's the amount of desirable forage we produced. And then the black bar is what we don't want, that's the weeds here. And you can see that, so where we did nothing, we grew 1,200, 1,500 pounds of good grass, but we grew really a lot of weeds right there. So it's a nice heavy place to do a good trial here, heavy weed infestation. When you look at where you just mowed, we did help. We moved the needle here, we grew more grass, and we grew fewer weeds there in this example. When you look at mowing versus mowing and fertilizing, you see that, well, we grew really about the same amount of grass, but we grew almost 1,000 more pounds of weeds there. So when we're putting out fertilizer, if we're not controlling the weeds, a lot of that fertilizer is going to go to the weeds, and that's really not where we want our money and resources to go, right? And you see that especially when you look at a fertilizer alone plot here. Yeah, we did grow a little bit more grass relative to the control, maybe double, but we also almost doubled the amount of weeds we grew. So again, we've got to be doing all these things, weed management in conjunction with our other efforts to really get to where we want to go. And so you look at here where we have the herbicide alone, we grew more grass because we removed that competition. We were able to completely remove the weeds, and that's good because here, and the one thing I didn't point out earlier with the mowing is there's still some weeds out there, and those things could still be poisonous. They still may be decreasing our forage utilization, whereas here, if we completely remove them, we know that those things are not at play anymore. But the best is when we're doing everything right. So assuming we're doing our grazing and haying management correctly here, we've also got proper fertility, and we have a herbicide out for a weed control. We grew over 8,000 pounds of forage there and removed the weeds. And so you see that's clearly where we want to go in terms of what we're doing for our forages in our pastures and our hay fields. So some data about the forage utilization of the animal. And this one's a little bit complicated, but I'll try to walk us through this. And this was done by my predecessor, Scott Haygood. But when we looked at control of horse nettle and then follow that about how much of the forage grass was there was actually utilized by the animal. And so we've got a percentage scale here. You see the green bar is control of horse nettle. So you can see that as horse nettle increased from 80 up here to over 90% control, we also increased the amount of forage that was utilized by the cattle. That's the amount that was actually grazed versus the amount that was left in the field. And so that went up from 70 up to 80%. So where we controlled horse nettle more, we got more utilization by the cattle in this case. Here we look at a non-treated, so we didn't do anything for weed control. We had a 0 there for horse nettle. Only about 30% of that forage was actually utilized, actually made it into the belly of the animal. So definitely where we see weed control, not only are we growing more forage, but we're actually getting more into the animal. And you can see that when you look at animal preferences. Now I know these are not small ruminants up here, and that's but I would think you'd agree that when you're looking for a good meal, whether we're talking about goats or sheep or cows or people, you want good food, right? You want it to taste good, and so you're going to go where you can get good food. And the animals, I think, are no different. So this was a study that was done with cattle here, and they had these GPS tracking collars on them. So they actually marked the location of the cow when it was in this head-down feeding position where it was grazing. And when the cattle was not feeding, like here, the location was not marked. And so they could track these animals of where they preferred to actually graze over time. So they set up a pasture, and we'll see some more slides, but basically one half was treated with herbicide, one half wasn't. There was nothing to keep the animals from going between the herbicide and then the non-herbicide treated side. I keep having this error, I keep forgetting to correct, but so this is, this should say treated over here, but so you see the differences here. Sometimes it's more pronounced than others through this pasture. So here's the overview of the pasture at the start of when they started tracking these animals. So the dividing line between where the herbicide was applied is kind of this diagonal line right here. So the yellow points are, that's where the herbicide was put out. Where the blue parts are, this kind of lower right part of the pasture, that's where the herbicide was not applied. So at the beginning, you can see they had about a 50-50 split. There was equal parts grazing, access to water, and again, there's nothing to prevent the animals moving from one side to the other. So, where did the animals go once we treated? Because this was prior to treatment. So here's 1 month later, and the animals still are about 50-50, right? So why am I showing you this? Well, so 1 month after herbicide application, it's taken a while for the herbicide to work, right? I usually don't like to judge whether herbicides controlled the weed or not till 1 month after application. And then you've got to have some time for actually the grasses and desirable plants to recover from that freedom from competition. So moving ahead in time here, 3 months after application, you see a huge shift in where the animals preferred to eat, right? Where the weeds were removed, the animals really grazed there. 84 of those fixes were there in the head down feeding position on the treated side versus only 16% on the other side. And when you move ahead time again to 4 months, you see a similar split, about 70-30 here, or 75-25 of where they were. And so one question I get a lot is I like what you can get out of a herbicide, but I've got legumes in my pasture and I want to keep those. And we don't really have any herbicide options for that, unfortunately. I wish we did. That's kind of the holy grail in the pasture forage herbicide market, would be able to control the weeds without killing the legumes, but we simply don't have that. But here, you can see where we controlled the legumes, and there were some present here. You could actually see that even without the legumes there, the animals still preferred this side. So something to keep in mind there. So when you look at it all together, including that first month where the needle wasn't really moved, here's what you see.
I take it Albany is a chemical, and is it?
Oh,
or is that the place?
Albany is the location. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So this was conducted in Missouri. I think the herbicide they put was Graze On Next out.
Does it have a residual?
So the question was, does Graze On Next have a residual? Yes, it does. So it depends on when you put it out, how long that's going to last, because what the factors that regulate herbicide degradation are things like moisture availability, the temperature, whether they're exposed to sunlight or not, how active is the soil microbial population. So my sort of rule of thumb is like if you wanted to come back and seed clovers after a Graze On Next application, we can do that we could seed clovers in the fall from like an early summer or spring application of Graze On Next, because it was hotter, we have moisture that's usually available there, and so we'll have a quicker degradation of that herbicide versus if you put it out in the fall and want to try to frost seed clovers. Over the winter, it's colder, herbicides don't degrade as quicker, so you might see some injury there if you put that out in the fall and then try to seed clovers again later. But what actually can be good about the residual of the herbicide is that it can provide us control after the application for a period of maybe 1 month. So things that are coming up, broadleaf weeds that come up 1 month after application can sometimes be controlled. And so a lot of our small seeded broadleaf weeds, so like common lamb's quarters or horseweed or some other ones out there, actually are pretty susceptible to this herbicide for a period. So that's sort of the two-edged sword, right? That's what's good about it is it has a residual, but that's also what's bad about it is it can persist in the environment.
As that goes along, are you saying that you would use that on pastures only and you wouldn't use it on hay because of the residual and the manure that might feed hay to other animals?
Yeah, so that's the other thing to consider is will it persist in hay and manure, and then so if it does persist, if you use that hay to make compost or use that manure to make compost and put it on your vegetable garden, you're going to be pretty unhappy with the results because it will persist through haying and through manure of the animals. So the label is very clear on this. It's do not use hay for composting or manure for composting, but you can apply it to a hay field. If you are harvesting that hay, though, you can't move the hay off farm in Virginia. So you can't sell that hay. You can't use the hay for composting, but you can feed that hay as long as it stays on that farm. Yes?
Just a quick question. If this were goats instead of cattle, how do you think it would change this?
Right. So if this were goats instead of cattle, it probably would change some, right? Because goats, I think, are less preferential in what they will eat versus cattle. So I think it will change some here for goats. But like I said, I like a good tasting meal just as much as the next guy. So I would think that the goats, given the choice, would probably prefer something that was better tasting than a patch that was full of weeds. But maybe you guys can educate me more on that because.
I think goats generally prefer. I did a study one time looking at. I think I had alfalfa and rosoma peanut and some really high quality forages to see which goats would prefer, and they ate the weeds first.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So all right. So maybe this wouldn't apply in all situations, but if we're talking about some other ruminants, maybe so. So one thing I wanted to point out is this soil testing, because we hear about we need a soil test, and that's good for us. It gives that competitive advantage to the forage. So what does that actually do? So another study from Missouri here is they looked at I think it was 46 sites here. Yep, 37, 46. 46 sites throughout the year. I think it was about a 10 foot diameter circle. They went to those sites every 2 weeks and looked at what was there as far as every species, every weed, every grass. They took soil samples from those so they could get detailed soil testing analysis done, and then they also looked at which were grazed and which weren't grazed as far as weeds and forages. And so what they found is that most of their soils were actually a little bit low, or most of their pastures surveyed were low in phosphorus. They were low in potassium. They had an average soil pH of 5.8. But what they could do with this data was correlate the number of weed species there with what the soil was like. And so certainly our soil is going to be a little bit different here in Virginia. But what they found out in Missouri is that when it had a 1 unit increase in soil pH, they had about 4,000 fewer weeds per acre. All right, so where they optimized that soil fertility and that soil pH level, they had fewer weeds. Potassium and phosphorus moved it a little bit, but not as much as the pH. So you had 61 and 12 fewer weeds per acre, respectively. When we look at specifically at common ragweed, again, they had a major movement with soil pH where they had a 1 unit movement in soil pH, or 1 unit increase, I should say. They had about 2,600 fewer common ragweed plants per acre. So something to think about with your soil fertility as far as the weeds. So how do we control weeds? And so the first thing, I guess let's transition a little better than that. So that's, I think some good data as to why we should be controlling weeds so we can get more productivity out of our pastures and forages. So how do we go about doing that? Obviously, like I said, we can't just look at the weed management in and of itself. We've got to be doing the other things right on our pastures. But the first thing to weed control is actually to identify the weeds. So we'll talk more about that this afternoon. Because that's the first thing. Well, I can't recommend a herbicide or a grazing practice or whether mowing is going to help you if I don't know what weed we're talking about. So all politics are local. I think all of weed management is probably pretty local too. I can't just give a blanket recommendation for every field that's represented here. So we've got to identify the weed because then we know something about the weed. We know, is it an annual, is it a perennial? When is it most susceptible to control measures? When is it least susceptible to control measures? And I'm just wasting my time and money going after that weed. So we know something about it. We know what times to try to attack that weed, do something about it. And that all kind of comes back to scouting, right? We've got to get out and look at our pastures and our hay fields and know where the problem weeds are, where they aren't, when are they coming a problem. And so scouting is very important here. And again, we can't really look at weed control by itself. So we've got some resources. Obviously, your local extension agent's very good. I think your friends and neighbors are pretty good. Weeds don't usually stop at a property border. So your neighbors might know what that weed is because they're probably dealing with the same thing. The co-ops usually have decent resources there as far as knowing weeds too, so you can bring them in there. We also have the Virginia Cooperative Extension Weed ID Clinic, and that is something that you can do free of charge through your county agent. If they don't know what that weed is, they can send it to my lab in Blacksburg, and we will do our best to figure out what that weed is. And then if you want a control recommendation, we'll provide that to you. We try to have a turnaround time of once we receive the sample of about 1 week. And I think we've been pretty good about that. So that's an option there if you go through your agent free of charge to get that weed identified, hopefully in a pretty timely manner. The other thing I'd point out is we have a weeds website. We're really trying to update and renovate that. That's good for confirming. I think if you think I think this is wing stem or horse nettle, you can click on the horse nettle. You'll see some pictures of it, and there's some information about that weed. But if you don't have any idea what it is, it's not really that good, and I'm looking to improve that. But the best website or app, it's both a website and an application that I found is again out of Missouri. I think Dr. Kevin Bradley's doing some pretty good work there, I guess. But this ID Weeds app, and so that's an app that you can actually go through, and you can put in, is this a broadleaf or is this a grass or grass-like? And then more questions will come up. What's the leaf arrangement, and it'll have little pictures there as if you don't know what alternate versus opposite or some of these other botanical terms are. As you can start selecting these, and it narrows this list that pops up there, and so it's probably going to get you within 5 or 10 weeds. For me, it's been about I'd say 60% accurate as far as getting me where I needed to go, but I get the really obscure things. I think for the more common weeds, it's probably a lot more accurate than that. So that's a resource there. That's the best weed ID app that I've seen. So once we've got the weed identified, if you're not familiar with our pest management guide, so in the field crop pest management guide, there's a whole chapter that's dedicated to forages that was really put a lot of effort into the update last year, and it's got a lot more content than it used to. So this is one of the tables in there. This is the herbicide efficacy table, and so you see a various range of herbicides that we have available to us in Virginia, and then various species here. And so these are grouped by our winter annuals, our summer annuals, herbaceous perennials, and then woody perennials. So this is actually a couple-page list. And you can see on this 0 to 10 scale what we would expect out of a properly timed herbicide application. So that resource is there. And then if you say, okay, so I think this is going to, well, I should say the other thing is it's usually never one weed, right? So you could say, okay, well, I might have an 8 versus a 10 here for field pennycress, but I'm also wanting to go after horseweed here, so I might choose something that gets a pretty good average on all the weeds that are in my pasture. So then you go through to the next table is the comments here, and it tells you some things that we think you need to know. This is not a substitute for the herbicide label, but some things that are good as far as using that herbicide, timings, rates. Can you put it out with some fertilizer? Those kinds of things. I'm going to actually jump to this one. So another table that is useful is these grazing and haying restrictions, because a lot of herbicides you actually need to pull the animals off and keep them off for a period of time, or not cut that forage for a certain time after application. So this table is a kind of a quick reference there. Okay, I think I want to use 2,4-D, and so I can see there's actually no grazing restriction on it, but if I want to put it out and then cut hay, I need to wait 30 days. So that's a quick reference. So like, okay, is that going to fit my management scheme? I want to cut hay in actually a couple weeks, so maybe I need to find a different herbicide. So when to apply is always a good question, because we don't get this is I think actually a pretty good time, because we can get really good control right now. Some of our winter annual weeds are already popping up and have been for probably a month now or more. But our summer annuals are all this tall. They're pretty much dead on their own. There's a stick and some seeds hanging off of it if they haven't already fallen to the ground. So we can't do any good about those summer annuals right now. But we can do something good about the winter annuals, and that's because right now they're young and they're actively growing. So whereas the summer annuals were young and actively growing back in May, maybe June, right? So that's the time that we need to be applying herbicides to get good efficacy out of those for our annual weeds. For biennial weeds, it's kind of the same way at that seedling stage where they're young and actively growing, or at the rosette stage. So for a lot of our thistles right now, horseweed is a good one to get right now this time of year. That can actually go all the way up as long as it stays warm, really up through Thanksgiving. And last year we could have probably done this through Christmas because it was so warm. But as long as it's decently warm, above 55 degrees, we can get pretty good activity this time of year and get those winter annuals. So you look at a winter annual when they're all flowering and stuff in the springtime, it's much more difficult to control. Herbicides don't work as well because the plant's basically reached the end of its life, right? It's flowered, it's set its seed, it's done what it was supposed to do. So a herbicide doesn't have really anything. It's not actively growing anymore. There's nothing for it to work on. For perennial weeds, the rule of thumb here, and there's always exceptions to these rules, but these are when in doubt, these are the best times to go at it. The early bud stage. So if you see the stalk and it's just about to flower, that's really a good time to go at it, because it's used all these resources from those underground structures, used all that energy up and put it into that plant, and we can actually get a lot of herbicide onto that plant, get a good dose, and then and hopefully control it at that time. The other sort of school of thought with perennials is this flowering or late fall timing. The fall timing, not the flowering time, but the fall timing. That's when the perennial is trying to send energy and resources and sugars it's making for photosynthesis back to underground so it can get through the winter and come back up in the spring. And so we put a herbicide on at that time. We kind of hitch a ride and get more movement of that herbicide down to those underground structures, because that's really what is the difficult thing to control about the perennials. We can control the top growth pretty easily, but getting those underground structures killed so it's not a problem next year, or less of a problem next year, is much more difficult. So those are the application timings. And we actually added this table to the pest management guide is for certain weeds that we get a lot of questions on, when is a good time throughout the year to apply a herbicide to that. So that table is in there as well. So a couple of herbicide updates. This is just real quick because usually this is the whole list right here that we get for pasture forage. But we actually have a couple more this year that got labels in pasture forage in Virginia. So Cypral H2O is a herbicide. This is a pre-emergence herbicide. So all of our other herbicides in pasture forages are post-emergence. After the weed comes up, we put them on and hopefully it kills the weed. This is pre-emergence, so we got to put it out before the weed actually emerges from seed. It's only going to control annuals, and if we're looking to seed like more desirable grasses to overseed or put in clovers into our mixture, you would not want to put this out before you put out that seed, because as it comes out from seed, it's going to take up the herbicide and kill that plant. So that's something new. We're still trying to figure out where it fits in Virginia as far as a good niche for us. If you're growing horse hay, I think there's this is a good option for you for a couple of grassy weeds that the horse people don't like to have there. But as far as you guys are concerned, it's going to help us from a pre-emergence perspective, but I'm not exactly sure that's that's the best way to go right now, just because I haven't been able to test it that much. Sharpen is another herbicide that got a pasture forage label to it. It's good at, I know it's good at horseweed control, post-emergence. I'm not sure what else it's really going to do for us. So we got a couple new products, but maybe not as exciting as what maybe you were hoping for. So then I'm going to go through some problem weeds. And before I do that, I actually brought some paperwork here, so I know I'm going to make a lot of friends. If you don't mind just passing that around. So this is a survey I'm conducting this winter to try to get a better grasp on what our major issues are, pasture forage weed management in Virginia. So if I'm missing the point here, this will provide me with some data for next time. I'll hopefully get more on point, get some good questions for you. It's also going to help me identify what the major problems are in terms of getting funding, research funding to look at those efforts. So don't feel like obligated. It's a voluntary survey, but it would help me out. So if you want to look at that, I appreciate that. So some problem weeds, these are ones I almost always get questions about. We'll go through this list here kind of one at a time. So the thistles are a good one that we usually get problems with. It's a spiny biennial, and so we actually have 3, 4, 5 different species of thistle. They're all biennial except for Canada thistle, and that's going to be a perennial rhizomatous spreading thistle. But all the other thistles are basically spiny biennials. Again, being a biennial, we need to target that rosette stage or that early growth stage, and so that's, again, right now you can see them. The problem with thistles is mostly we don't really pay any attention to them till they're this tall and they're covered in all these spines, and we just can't get rid of them. And there's really not any herbicides that are going to do any good once they're flowering, once they've bolted up from that rosette stage. But at the rosette stage, we've actually got some good options here. So these numbers you see after Graze On Next, which is formerly Forefront. So if you're familiar with Forefront, and you go to the store and you can't find Forefront, it's now Graze On Next. But these numbers are the rating we give it in the efficacy table. So that's a 9 out of 10, or approximately 90% control. There's chaparral and then milestone. So we actually already kind of went through the aminopyrrolid restrictions for Graze On Next. Aminopyrrolid's also in chaparral and milestone. So that's a good option. If you don't want to use that, or you want a non-residual herbicide, then I would probably recommend crossbow. A high rate of crossbow properly timed will get you pretty far, maybe like an 8 instead of a 9. If you're selling hay, Graze On P plus D is another option as picloram instead of aminopyrrolid. But there's a 30-day restriction there, whereas we can't sell hay if we use any of these. Can't sell hay off farm. Any questions about thistles? Okay. Horse nettle. So horse nettle seems to be probably if you ask me what is probably the most common weed we have in pastures in Virginia, I'd probably say horse nettle. It's a spiny perennial, so it comes back every year. This is probably about what it looks like right now. Maybe it's just a stem with these little berries, yellow berries on it, and the leaves have already gone away. But it's got this white kind of purple flower, comes out about middle of summer, and it's a problem for us, right? It's there every year. This is one that the animals generally that I've seen won't actually graze it. Maybe goats are an exception to that, but I haven't seen this one graze very often. This is a perennial, so again, that early bud stage, or as it's preparing for winter dormancy is typically the time, but this is one of the exceptions where you really want to wait till it's in full flower before we make the application of herbicide. When it's in full flower, that's when we get the best effect of it. I've had some complaints about this. Is like, I used Graze On Next, it looked great. Next summer, it was all back there, and it didn't seem like I did any good 1 year later. What I think happened is if you did properly time that application, we probably killed and did a lot of good on a lot of those perennials, but we probably had these berries out in the field dropping seed there for over 10 years or maybe more in some cases. And so if we've got a really big seed bank there, we might actually be doing good on those weeds that year, but then there's more coming up from seed. And perhaps that's where the prowl would come in as a good option. And that's one of the things I want to look for. I will say is if we're looking at perennial weeds and we're looking at that fall timing, once we start seeing the senescence of those leaves, they're starting to change color and then fall off the plant. That's when we can't apply that herbicide anymore, because we're not going to get any uptake out of that leaf. There's probably already an abscission layer of dead cells there between the leaf and the stem, and so we're not going to get any movement from that herbicide across those dead cells at that point. Any questions about horse nettle, sandbriar? Tall ironweed is another one, and this is one that mowing can actually do a lot of good on this weed. And so that's something that I would say is something we need to be utilizing. Some of these taller weeds, right, sometimes it's hard to get a spray boom across, so we have to get a mower across them before we can actually treat the regrowth. And that does a lot of good. And so when you think about what that does to the plant, a perennial plant, is it's going to put, just like timing that herbicide application, it's got to put all those resources into growing that plant. When we whack that off with a mower, it's got to do that again, and so it kind of further drains and weakens those underground perennial structures on those weeds. And so mowing is actually pretty well recommended for this weed. That's not going to get you all the way there, so if you treat the regrowth when it's 12 inches or so, careful not to let it get too much before you treat it again. But if we mow it, then we can actually go something out there with just 2,4-D Banville, which is a pretty cheap option. Doesn't have any soil residual to worry about, and get pretty good control. So the mowing you'd want to time again at that early bloom stage, and then obviously it's going to depend on how environmental factors, how much rain there was, how much sunlight there was, what was the temperature, as far as how quickly it gets back to where we want to treat that regrowth. But 12 inches is about what you want to see. You want enough foliage on that regrowth to when you spray the herbicide, there's some leaf surface there for the herbicide to land on. If there's not any leaf surface there, you just got some stems there because you came back too soon, then you're probably not going to get as much control. All right, so stickweed is the next one. That's the most common name I've heard for this. It's also called yellow crownbeard or wing stem. This picture may be kind of hard. It actually has wings on the stem here. And so to me, wing stem is maybe a little bit better name than stickweed. But lost my train of thought there. So there's two species of this. The one has alternate leaves, the one has opposite leaves, but they basically respond to herbicides the same. This is a perennial, but this, in my mind, is a pretty weak perennial. We can control this without some of the more expensive herbicides. So just 2,4-D plus Banville at a proper application timing can help. Right now we're too late, and even probably like September you're probably too late for this. But when we again get that early bud stage before the yellow flower appears, we can get some good control. Part of the problem with this one though is it can be 6 feet tall before it actually gets to that early bud stage, and then you're trying to, well, what am I going to do with this? And so it's where, again, mowing, like ironweed, it's not as effective on stickweed as it is on ironweed, but what it actually does is it basically makes a really upright plant, force it to regrow. That's going to, again, reduce the underground energy reserves, but it also makes a bushier plant. It releases it from apical dominance, and so it has all these lateral sprouts that come out. And from a herbicide application perspective, that's good because we've got more leaf area to intercept the herbicide spray, so we can get in effectiveness a higher dose of that herbicide onto the weeds. So mowing can help. We've got some pretty effective herbicide options there. All right, so the blackberry or the rubus species, this is a problematic one. Generally, these guys are going to take at least 2 years of effort to get rid of. I wish we had just a magic solution that would just get rid of them, but it's going to take some treatments here over the course of 2 years probably to fully eradicate these guys. You can do a lot of good in 1 year, maybe 70–80% control, but you're not going to fully get rid of them in 1 year. We just don't have anything that can help us there. So first thing I would say, I should probably put this higher up, is mowing isn't going to do anything for us with blackberry. In fact, it might make our problems worse, okay? So mowing doesn't do us any good on blackberry, and it actually can hurt if we want to mow and put a herbicide. It can actually reduce the efficacy of that herbicide. Why that is I've got some thoughts on, but the fact of the matter is this actually can hurt the herbicide effectiveness. So, and that's like within 1 year of actually treating it. So if you mowed it this year, even next year you might see reduced efficacy of a herbicide application where you didn't mow it. And then there's also, I guess the flip side of that is mowing afterwards. So we can, like crossbow, 6 weeks after you put it on looks pretty good, but if you mowed at 6 weeks after treatment, you can reduce the efficacy of that herbicide versus if you mowed 3 months after treatment. So it's kind of tempting to get out there. It looks like it's dead. I'm going to go ahead and knock it down and get it out of the way. I'd say you probably need to go ahead and wait a little longer. So what herbicides we have that are pretty effective? This is my standard recommendation. Is it's Remedy Ultra plus net sulfuron. So net sulfuron's, yes.
If we're talking goats and lambs, though, doesn't that contain a certain amount of protein that's actually good? They like the browse.
Sure. So you may not want to do this. This is, yeah. So all the weeds are going to have some certain level of nutritive value to them. So you may not want to do that for goats and lambs. But if you do want to get rid of it because it's sticking you in the legs as you're walking through the pasture, then you know there's some effort there. So this works well. We just don't want to put metsulfuron out in the pasture twice in Virginia because it will suppress our tall fescue. And if we put it out 2 years in a row, we can actually start reducing the tall fescue stand there. So we get rid of the metsulfuron in year 2 and put in Graze On Next or Pasture Guard. That's all the problems I was going to go over. Yes, any questions?
Would you treat just a patch? Like
Yeah.
you're talking about the blackberry?
Sure, you can absolutely just treat a patch. And usually, it depends on the scale of your farm. A lot of people are like, well, I don't have time to treat because it takes more time to spot treat. But if you could spot treat, it's almost always more effective than a broadcast application because you can get more herbicide on those weeds. So definitely you can, spot treating is an option for these. You'd want to look at the label because the spot treatment rate's usually a little bit different than the broadcast rate, but it'll tell you how much to put in a 3-gallon sprayer, for example, versus how much to put in a 100-gallon tank for spraying 10 acres. So.
What about poison ivy in Virginia? Is there anything?
Yeah, so poison ivy I almost always recommend Remedy. Remedy Ultra is what I recommend. And the spot treatment of Remedy has been pretty effective for me. Trying to think of.
When you have show goats, though, you have to touch the show goats, so you don't want the poison ivy. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yes. Mulberry? I can't say I've had a lot of experience with mulberry. I'm going to say it's probably not going to do much good with it. Have you tried that? Okay. A lot. It's kind of surprising. We can get some good control of some of the herbaceous broadleafs, but when you start getting some woody-ish kind of weeds, then they tend to almost proliferate in some cases with mowing. So I don't know that I would recommend that, but I haven't had enough experience really to say. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in here. It's tried that.
I've got a little bushy, about 18 inches tall, got a lot of little white flowers all over it now. What is that?
Did you? Yeah.
About 18 inches tall, got a
Yeah.
heavy stem to it, and the bush is out about this wide, and it's got all kinds of little white flowers on it.
Yeah, it's really, really tough to identify from
I'm
that,
not sure
but
a picture of it, but you did.
did you bring a sample?
No, I didn't.
I hate to venture a guess without seeing it. I've got a couple things in mind, but I might just. If you can, when we get together later, if you could send me a picture, or we could try the weed app. Yeah, yeah. So. Yes.
What about old-fashioned shovel, dig a little bit, pull it up by the root? Are you going to encourage that plant to send out more little plants, or are you really helping?
If you get the whole plant, then the shovel works great. If you're breaking it off at the surface of the ground, then you're probably wasting your time. But definitely you could do it that way. It's not, I like walking by and spraying it a little bit better than that, but but certainly that's an effective option.